you hear this story, some of you might think my friends and I were just arrogant. You'll probably look at us as typical naive city kids who didn't respect the rules of the wilderness. And honestly, maybe you're right. But what happened to us that night on the Appalachian Trail, no amount of wilderness training or logic could have ever prepared us for it. To this day, if I close my eyes in a quiet room, I can still hear that voice. This happened in May of last year. My best friend since college, Mark, his girlfriend Sarah and I decided to go on a 3-day backpacking trip. We chose an offbeat, lesser-known trail deep within the Great Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. We weren't amateurs, we were experienced hikers, so looking for a bit of an adventure, we intentionally veered off the main, heavily trafficked tourist paths to camp deeper in the old-growth forest. The first day was incredible. The smell of the pine needles, the crisp mountain air, the rushing streams, it was exactly what we needed to escape the city. But by the afternoon of the second day, the atmosphere shifted. The weather turned sour fast. A thick, heavy mountain fog rolled in out of nowhere. Within an hour, it was so dense that I could barely see my own hand stretched out in front of me. And then the forest went dead silent. If you spend enough time in the deep woods, you know exactly what this means. Hunters call it the quiet, when every single bird, insect, and small animal suddenly stops making noise. It means an apex predator has entered the immediate area, and the entire ecosystem is holding its breath in sheer terror. We assumed there was a mountain lion or a large black bear tracking us. We gripped our hiking poles a little tighter and picked up our pace, desperate to reach our designated campsite before total darkness hit. It was only 5 p.m., but under the canopy of the trees and the heavy fog, it felt like midnight. As we hurried down the narrow path, Sarah started to lag behind. She stopped to retie her hiking boot. Mark and I were only about 10 paces ahead of her when we heard her voice call out from the thick fog behind us. She said, "Mark, Liam, wait up. My backpack strap is caught on a branch." Mark and I stopped and turned around. We could see the vague, blurry silhouette of Sarah standing in the grey mist. Mark called back, "Hurry up, Sarah. We're losing light fast." And right then, the bushes to my immediate left rustled violently. Out stepped Sarah. Standing right next to me on the left was Sarah. She had her backpack on, and she was casually chewing on a protein bar. She looked at Mark and me completely confused and asked, "What are you guys doing? Who are you talking to over there?" My entire body went completely numb. The blood rushed to my ears, and a cold sweat broke across my forehead. If I looked to my left, there was Sarah. If I looked straight ahead into the fog, there was also Sarah. The color completely drained from Mark's face. His hands shook as he unclipped the flashlight from his belt and aimed the beam directly into the fog at the silhouette. The light cut through the mist, illuminating the figure standing on the trail. It looked exactly like Sarah. The same red jacket, the same braided blonde hair, the same muddy hiking boots. But something was profoundly, sickeningly wrong with it. The posture wasn't human. It stood completely rigid, its arms pinned flat against its sides like a plastic mannequin. And its face. The features looked blurred, like a poorly rendered photograph. It was as if someone had taken a raw slab of meat and clumsily stretched a rubber mask of Sarah's face over it. But the worst part was the smile. A human jaw physically cannot open that wide. It stretched all the way back to its earlobes, revealing too many teeth. The thing in the fog spoke again. It used Sarah's exact voice, but the sound didn't come from its mouth. It felt like it was projecting from the air all around us, echoing off the trees. It said, "Mark, Liam, wait up. My backpack strap is caught on a branch." The real Sarah looked at her duplicate, let out a blood-curdling scream, and dropped her protein bar into the dirt. Mark didn't hesitate for a single second. He grabbed Sarah's arm, yanked her forward, and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Run! Run now!" We ditched our heavy backpacks right there on the trail and sprinted blindly into the dark. We completely lost the trail within minutes. All we knew was that whatever was behind us was not of this world. Growing up in the Appalachian region, you hear the local folklore, stories about skinwalkers or mimics, ancient nameless entities that mimic human voices to lure prey into the deep woods. We always thought they were just spooky campfire stories meant to scare tourists. That evening, we learned the stories were real. We ran blindly for what felt like 20 minutes, our lungs burning, our hearts hammering against our ribs. The fog was suffocating, and the darkness was absolute. Just as Sarah was about to collapse from exhaustion, my flashlight beam hit something solid ahead, an old, abandoned wooden hunter's cabin. The door was hanging half off its hinges. Mark yelled, "In there! Go! Go! Go!" We threw ourselves inside the cabin. Mark and I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, dragging a rotting oak table across the floorboards to barricade it. The interior smelled of damp mold, dust, and old pine. We crawled into the farthest corner of the room, huddling together in the pitch black. Our only weapon was Mark's small pocket knife, which felt pathetic against whatever was tracking us. We stared through the cracks in the wooden walls, looking out into the silent black woods. The forest had returned to that dead, heavy quiet. It was roughly 10 p.m. No one said a word. The only sound was our synchronized, ragged breathing. Then, a massive thud shook the roof directly over our heads. It sounded like a heavy, four-legged creature had landed on the ceiling. The rotting beams groaned under immense weight. We instantly clapped our hands over our mouths, choking back screams. Sarah was weeping silently, her body shaking violently against mine. The creature in the fog walked slowly across the roof, its weight shifting heavily. Then the scratching sound moved down the exterior wooden wall. Whatever it was, it had climbed down. It was standing right outside the front door. We looked through the gap at the bottom of the barricaded door. In the dim moonlight filtering through the fog, we saw 2 feet, but they weren't human feet. They were massive, cloven hooves, like those of a giant goat, but they were stuffed violently inside Sarah's spare hiking boots. The thing had found our abandoned backpacks, taken her boots, and forced its deformed limbs inside. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the wooden door. A voice drifted through the cracks of the door, but it wasn't Sarah's voice anymore. It was my voice. The thing spoke using my exact cadence, my exact tone, saying, "Mark, Sarah, open the door. It's freezing out here. It's me, Liam. I got separated from you guys in the fog. Please, let me in." Hearing my own voice coming outside that door while I was sitting inside the room did something to my psyche. It was a sickening, unnatural violation. I felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. Mark stared at me in the dark, his eyes wide with a manic, terrified confusion. Intellectually, he knew I was sitting right next to him, but hearing me beg for help outside was actively breaking his mind. The entity didn't stop. For the next 4 hours, it stood outside that door, relentlessly cycling through our 3 voices. It was like a broken tape recorder, stitching our words together into a grotesque, mocking symphony. From the other side of the door, it would cry in Sarah's voice, "Please, it's so cold." Then it would switch to Mark's voice, shouting, "Something's out here with me, help." And then it would mimic me again, saying, "Just open the door, guys, it's Liam." Around 2 a.m., the thing's patience finally snapped. It stopped mimicking us, and then it let out a sound that I will hear on my deathbed, a metallic, screeching, ungodly roar that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a man. It sounded like tearing metal and a dying scream mixed into one. And then it started throwing its weight against the door. The entire cabin shook. Dust and wood shavings rained down on us from the ceiling. The old wooden door began to splinter down the center. We knew that within a few more hits, the barricade would give way and we would be slaughtered. Mark stood up, holding his tiny pocket knife out, tears streaming down his face, ready to die fighting. Sarah and I held on to each other, praying to whatever God would listen. The top panel of the door finally shattered open. Through the newly formed gap, that grey, featureless, eyeless mask of a face pushed through, staring into the cabin with its impossibly wide, teeth-filled grin.
But right as it began to tear the remaining wood away, a sound echoed from deep within the valley. It was the distant echoing wail of a large truck horn, followed by the faint barking of search and rescue hounds. The sun was beginning to rise. The distant sound of a logging truck on the highway sliced through the morning air. The moment the sound reached the cabin, the creature froze. It turned its head at a sharp, unnatural angle, listening. Slowly, it backed its head out of the shattered door. We heard it drop onto all fours, and with terrifying speed, it bolted back into the dense, dark thicket of the Appalachian brush, the sound of breaking branches fading into the distance. We didn't move from that corner until 7 a.m., when the sun was fully blinding through the cracks in the walls. We didn't look for our gear. We didn't look for our phones. We ran down the mountain until we hit the asphalt of Route 129, flagged down a passing motorist, and begged them to drive us to the local sheriff's department. The police, of course, treated us like we were crazy. They wrote a report stating we likely suffered from a combination of dehydration, panic, and a potential encounter with an aggressive black bear. But when the forest rangers went out to locate the abandoned cabin a day later, they found things they couldn't explain. There were no human footprints outside the cabin door. There were massive, deep cloven hoofprints stamped into the mud with immense force. The gouge marks on the oak door were over 8 feet off the ground, far too high for any black bear native to North Carolina. And stranger still, Sarah's spare hiking boots were found discarded 50 yards into the brush. The thick rubber soles and leather interiors had been completely melted and warped from the inside out, as if a pair of searing hot, fleshless limbs had been violently forced into them. It has been a year since that night. The 3 of us are back in the city, trying our best to live normal lives. Needless to say, none of us have stepped foot near a forest since. But my experience with the duplicate didn't end in North Carolina. Just last week, Mark and I were sitting in a crowded coffee shop downtown. Suddenly, Mark's phone started ringing. He picked it up and put it on speaker, assuming it was a work call. The voice that came through the speaker made me drop my coffee cup straight onto the tile floor. It was Sarah's voice, exactly her voice, except the real Sarah was currently across town at her office. The voice on the phone spoke very slowly, dripping with that same mechanical, rhythmic cadence we heard in the woods. "Mark, Liam, you guys ran so fast, but I still remember what you sound like. I'm coming." Mark slammed the phone down, his hands shaking violently. We checked the caller ID. There was no phone number. The screen simply read, "Unknown caller." To anyone listening to this who loves backpacking, hiking, or camping in the deep, ancient woods of America, I have one piece of advice for you. If you are ever out on a trail and you hear your friend or your loved one calling out for help from the fog behind you, do not just turn around and run to them. Look next to you first. Make absolutely sure you know where your friends are, because in those deep forgotten ridges there is something waiting, and it wants nothing more than to take your voice and use it to knock on your door.
The next story. I don't usually share my personal life on the internet. Honestly, I've spent the last few months trying to convince myself that I'm just losing my mind, that maybe the isolation is finally getting to me. But what's been happening, it's a weight I can't carry alone anymore. I know some of you listening to this will think I'm making it up for clout, or that I'm just trying to write a cheap creepypasta. I deeply, truly wish this was just a story, but the jagged scars on my right wrist and the sounds coming from inside my wall every single night, they are very real. Everything started back in September of last year. I bought a house just outside of Columbus, Ohio. It was an old Dutch colonial-style home built somewhere in the late 1930s. If you live in the Midwest, you know the exact type. Beautiful, creaky hardwood floors, a slightly damp basement that smells like old earth, and a whole lot of character. The price was incredibly low for the current housing market, mostly because the interior needed some serious cosmetic work, specifically the drywall and some flooring upstairs. Since I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, I set up my home office in a spacious room on the second floor. For the first 3 weeks, it was perfect, quiet, isolated, and peaceful. Or so I thought. By the first week of October, I noticed something strange about the house's temperature. Even with the central heating blasted up to 72 degrees, my office would suddenly plummet into freezing territory. But it wasn't the whole room, it was just one specific corner right against the north-facing wall. If you stood there, you could literally see your breath misting in the air. I figured it was just bad insulation, a typical drafty old house problem. But then, 2 nights later, the scratching started. The first time I heard it, it was around 2 a.m. I assumed it was mice or squirrels. In Ohio, when the weather starts to turn cold, rodents love to crawl into the walls of old houses to find warmth. I walked over to the corner, rapped my knuckles hard against the drywall, and the scratching stopped instantly. I shrugged it off, sat back down at my desk, and went back to editing my designs. But the next night, it happened again, exactly at 2:14 a.m. I know the precise time because the digital clock on my dual monitors was staring right back at me. Only this time, it wasn't scratching, it was a whisper. It was a raspy, dry, hollow voice. It sounded like someone was pressed tightly inside the narrow, hollow space behind the drywall, breathing out words with their very last bit of energy. It was so faint at first that I couldn't make out the syllables. It just sounded like static. But I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't an animal. It was human. The desperate, parched voice of a person. Bob walked into my office with a high-end thermal imaging camera. He started scanning the north wall to see if there were any signs of a nest or a rodent infestation. Suddenly, Bob stopped, the color completely drained from his face. I walked up behind him. "Bob, did you find anything?" Bob didn't answer. He just slowly turned the screen of the thermal camera toward me. Now, if you know how thermal cameras work, living creatures show up as bright red, orange, or yellow because of body heat. But what was on that screen made my blood turn to ice. Inside the narrow, hollow space between the studs of my wall, there was a distinct silhouette. It was the unmistakable shape of a human being standing upright, completely rigid. But it wasn't red or orange. It was a deep, radiant neon blue. It was a pocket of absolute, freezing zero within the wall. Bob's hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped the camera. He whispered, "David, I've pulled rats, raccoons, and even dead stray cats out of walls, but I have never seen anything like this. That's not an animal, and that cold, that's physically impossible. Look, son, I'm not charging you for this. You don't need an exterminator. You need to call a priest or the police." Bob packed up his gear and practically ran out of my house. He left his clipboard right there on my kitchen counter. He didn't care. He just wanted out. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly stood up from my chair, my legs shaking, and walked over to the freezing corner of the room. I pressed my right ear flat against the cold drywall. I held my breath, listening into the dead silence of the house. From the other side of the plaster, a voice breathed, "Help, please, let me out." A violent shiver ran down my spine. I stumbled backward, tripping over my office chair. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it had to be an acoustic anomaly. Old American houses from that era often have shared air ducts or ventilation shafts where sound from the basement or the street can echo and sound like it's coming from inside a wall. I grabbed a flashlight, went down into the pitch-black basement and checked the furnace. Nothing. I searched the entire house. There was no one there. I was completely alone. Over the next week, the whisper became a horrifying routine. Every single night, precisely at 2:14 a.m., the voice would wake me up, and it would go on until 4 a.m. The worst part? It was getting clearer, closer, and then it started using my name. "David, David, open the wall. It's so cold in here. They are coming." I stopped sleeping. I developed deep, dark circles under my eyes. My hands shook constantly, and I couldn't focus on my work. I was terrified in my own home. Finally, on a Thursday morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I called a local pest control company. An older, weathered guy named Bob showed up. He had been doing this in Ohio for 30 years. He listened to my explanation with a polite, skeptical smile, clearly thinking I was just another paranoid first-time homeowner. That was the breaking point. I decided I wasn't spending another night in that house. I grabbed a duffel bag and started packing enough clothes to stay at a cheap motel near downtown Columbus for a few weeks. It was around 1:45 a.m. Suddenly, the entire house went pitch black. The power was out. Now, power outages during Ohio storms aren't rare, but the storm hadn't even fully hit yet. The air was dead silent. I pulled out my iPhone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, dusty hallway. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the stairs. I just needed to get to my car. But just as my foot hit the top step, the old analog clock down in the living room began to chime. Tick, tick, tick. 2:14 a.m. A violent crash echoed from my office. The sound was so loud it shook the floorboards beneath my feet. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run down the stairs, jump into my car, and never look back. But terror has this sickening way of paralyzing you, of drawing you to the very thing you fear. Like a moth to a flame, I slowly turned around. I pointed my phone's flashlight down the hallway, aiming it straight into my open office door. The north wall, the drywall, was bulging outward. It looked like someone was trapped inside a heavy sheet of latex, desperately pushing, kicking, and throwing their weight against the plasterboards. "David, let me out! They are watching me!" It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a screech, a guttural, agonizing, unhuman shriek that didn't just fill the room. It vibrated inside my actual skull. Right before my eyes, a massive vertical crack split down the center of the wall. Pieces of white plaster crumbled onto the hardwood floor, and through that crack, an odor billowed out into the room. It was an overpowering, suffocating stench of absolute rot. It smelled like 90-year-old decay, stagnant water, and damp earth from a freshly dug grave. I gagged, dropping my flashlight. I tried to back away, but my knees buckled. I fell to the floor, scrambling backward on my hands and knees. Through the darkness of the split wall, a hand emerged. But it wasn't normal. The skin was a sickly, translucent grey, tightly shrink-wrapped around long, skeletal fingers. The nails were jagged, cracked and stained with dried black filth. The hand clawed blindly at the air, its joints popping loudly in the silence. Then a face pushed through the fractured drywall. It had no eyes. Where its eyes should have been, there were only two deep, hollow, pitch-black sockets. The skin of its face was pulled back so tightly against the skull that it had split around the cheeks, exposing a row of jagged, yellowed teeth. The creature forced its head through the gap, turning its neck at a sickening, unnatural angle. And then those empty black sockets locked directly onto me. It smiled, a wide, jaw-snapping grin that stretched from ear to ear. It began tearing at the drywall with its other hand, widening the hole, dragging its emaciated, elongated torso out into my office. I realized right then that if this thing fully stepped out of that wall, I was going to die. When you are pushed past the absolute limit of human fear, your brain snaps. You either freeze or you fight. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I reached out blindly in the dark, my hand brushing against my heavy metal desk lamp and a utility box cutter I had left on the floor. I grabbed them both. The creature had successfully dragged its upper body out of the wall. It lunged forward with impossible speed, its rotten, icy hand slashing through the dark. Before I could move, its jagged fingernails tore into my right wrist. The pain was blinding. It felt like liquid nitrogen was being injected straight into my veins. I screamed, but I didn't stop. I swung the heavy metal lamp with everything I had, slamming it directly into the side of its desecrated face. Crack! It sounded like old brittle wood snapping in half. The creature let out a high-pitched, deafening wail that shook the windows. It stumbled backward, flailing blindly. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet, kicked the entity away from me, and sprinted down the stairs, threw open the front door, ran out into the pouring rain, got into my car, and drove straight to the Columbus Police Department. The police, understandably, thought I was experiencing a severe psychotic break or a drug reaction, but when they saw the state of my right wrist, the deep, jagged lacerations leaking a strange blackish-red fluid, and noticed the pure, unadulterated terror in my eyes, they dispatched a couple of units to my house. The next morning, 2 detectives called me into the station. What they found inside that wall is something I will never recover from. The police had completely demolished the north wall of my office. Inside the hollow space between the studs, a gap measuring barely 10 inches wide, they found a hidden, recessed compartment that wasn't on any of the original blueprints of the house. Inside that dark, claustrophobic void lay a skeleton. According to the forensic pathologist, the remains belonged to a young woman who had gone missing in the area back in the mid-1950s. But the most horrifying detail was how she died. Her arms and legs had been systematically broken so her body could be forcefully crammed into that 10-inch gap. Someone had shoved her in there while she was still alive and then quietly drywalled over her, leaving her to suffocate in total darkness. The interior wood of the studs was covered with thousands of deep, frantic scratch marks. She had spent days trying to claw her way out. But there was one question the police could never answer for me. If those remains were a dead, stagnant skeleton for the last 70 years, what was it that Bob saw moving on his thermal camera? And if those wounds on my wrist came from a long-dead corpse, who was it that broke through the drywall and smiled at me in the dark? I never went back to that house. I broke the lease, left all my furniture behind, and let the bank foreclose on it. I moved halfway across the country. I live in a modern apartment now. No drywall, just solid, thick concrete walls. But I still don't sleep, because for the past 3 nights, precisely at 2:14 a.m., I've been hearing a very familiar, raspy, dry whisper from the other side of the solid concrete. It breathes, "David, it doesn't matter where you go, I'm always just on the other side."